My topic today, I developed this topic extensively last night. So if you want to see a fuller version of what I'm going to talk about today, you can go to my YouTube channel for my Friday night teaching. I want to add to that today. This will be a separate and distinct teaching. Last night I had a bit of a different focus. So I always want to remind you, whenever I teach about politics, current events, I have to take a long step back and realize what we're talking about is something that has to do with the meaning of human experience, which means not just the fact that there are haters, but why people hate. Why there is willful, not just that there is willful ignorance, but why there is willful ignorance. Not that they're not just the fact that we, and I'm going to say the West, the United States, and Israel are in a war, and I don't think I'm overstating it. That's going to affect on the development of civilization and human civilization, because there are forces in the world that are actively want to destroy what we would call the core elements of Western civilization, which is the liberal state, meaning the idea of rights-endowed individuals that have a series of God-endowed rights, including, for example, the right to speak and the right to think and the right to your possessions and your property, the right to find work, the right to go about your business without the interference of other people. We're going to call this liberty, or hence the liberal state. The idea that there is a natural law, natural rights, the function of language, this is going to sound astonishing that we even have to say this, that words actually contain meaning, and they don't mean whatever we want them to mean. There's something called language, and that needs to be talked about. The capacity for reason, because if we can't reason, we can never communicate ideas. We can never change our minds. And of course, the idea of truth. So there are many things at stake. And so on one hand, when you hear the teachings of what I'll call postmodernism, that's one teaching. Secondly, critical theory gone bad in neo-Marxism, number two. And number three, what I'm going to call brutal theocracies, for example, of Iran and Hamas. All of these are posed against Western civilization. Now, I think whatever our unique sacred system is, I'd say the vast majority of Jewish teachings, from non-observant, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, all identify with what I'm going to call the project of Western civilization that I described earlier. So one thing we have to see is this is not just campus unrest. This is campus unrest rooted in ideas that are antithetical to the liberal state, to Western civilization, and therefore, I think, antithetical to human well-being and the future of human well-being. Now, again, I'm not an alarmist. I mean, I don't think this war is anywhere but one is anywhere decided. In fact, I don't think the enemies of the moral, metaphysical foundation of the liberal state, I don't think we're in any particular imminent danger. But I am concerned, as you know, that as I look at my teaching of Jewish adults and young adults for my entire life, people are simply not equipped to give an argument for this idea, which I think is an essential idea and integral to Judaism, by the way, and believe in things that open themselves up to atrocious ideas and atrocious quasi-religions. So because of what's happening in Israel on the campuses, I want to repeat some of that today, but I want to put it in the context of people seeking meaning in life, people seeking truth in life, people seeking for wisdom on how to live. And I believe that the teachings of postmodernism, neo-Marxism, Islamist, again, not Islam, but this particular Islamist teaching are all antithetical to what we love and stand for. So I want to break this down a little bit more from what I did last night. So part of the story that I told, those who were here last night, those will be familiar to you, is that when I look at my wide range of teaching, when I began to be a teacher in the community, I'm talking about Brandeis Bardeen, Wexner Heritage Foundation, retreats for young adults, retreats for adults, speaking at high schools and so forth, I ran into two completely contradictory ideas. And the people to whom I was speaking were not cognizant that they believed in two such contradictory ideas. And I want to share this with you because if you believe in the things that I stand for, and I'll repeat them a few times, the things I stand for are first, moral realism, natural law, and natural rights, which means as human beings, we have equality before the divine. We have ideally equality, legal equality before the state. We have a natural right for liberty to pursue our interests without the interference of the state or other people. From a natural law perspective, we also have moral duties. We have moral duties toward other people, which means we don't just have rights against other people interfering. We have moral duties to benefit other people and to benefit the ideas and institutions for which we stand. So the natural law, natural rights tradition sees us as rights-endowed individuals and duty-endowed individuals. Next thing is our understanding of language. That for all the subjectivity of the linguistic experience, we are talking about an objective world, and this is where I really want to push it, the objectivity of a moral reality. Now, therefore, I'm a moral realist. I'm a moral objectivist, which means there is an objective moral reality that is not reducible to inner moral experience. Now, this is where I get the most pushback when I teach, where people say to me, don't we experience morality within? Is it not a subjective experience? Isn't it all relative to the person or the culture? Therefore, how can you say there are better and worse answers to moral questions when, Rabbi Finley, isn't it all subjective? My response is, of course, morality is experienced subjectively. God is experienced subjectively. That doesn't mean that morality is a product of our subjectivity, or that reality is a product of our subjectivity. God, morality, they're not products of subjectivity, they're experienced subjectively. So another way of saying it, and I believe C.S. Lewis taught about this, and again, I'm going back to a distant memory, somehow the danger of the loss of the human being, which goes something like this. And again, forgive me for my not remembering precisely. It goes something like this. When people want to examine an idea, for example, the good, there's a tendency to see through the good, for example, David Hume and moral relativists and moral subjectivists, and say, oh, when you look through the good, it's nothing but human opinion. Meaning I've seen through it and now I see what's really standing behind it. Or when people talk about the beautiful, I've seen through it, it's all in the metaphoric eye of the beholder, which means you don't want to get a physician to start taking apart your eye, which some people actually tried to do. In the Scottish Enlightenment, like, is it really in the eye? They took that seriously. No, it's actually not in your eye. So people said, isn't beauty subjective? And my response is, the experience of beauty is subjective. But when I say that's beautiful, I don't say I experience that as beautiful. What I say quite naturally is that's beautiful. So I'm participating in the idea of some kind of objective reality where we use the word beauty. And I say, well, no, I can see through it, and that's only subjectivity. It's nothing but subjectivity. And many philosophers, including C.S. Lewis, say there are some words you can't look through. So love is one of them. I remember I was alarmed when I arrived at college and I was informed by a rabbi that love is simply a word that allows the patriarchal subjugation of women. I didn't say it, but I thought to myself, I really feel sorry for you, because I actually think we love people, and for me, love is an act, is a willingness to be of service, and a word of preference, a word that indicates willingness to sacrifice. So when I think of the ideal of love, I think there are better and worse ways to love. But this person, a rabbi, by the way, saw through the word love and said, it's just a patriarchal manipulation to oppress women. I thought, I wondered, is your marriage okay? Because that's not what I think, love should be. But all right, so when I think of these words, love, justice, again, from a moral relativistic perspective, people say, I've seen through justice. And I had many people, Jewish adults, young people, teenagers, all say the same thing. It's as if they all went to the same school, but no one could tell me where they learned these ideas. They just knew this, that justice is simply a reflection of society, which means it's social mores constructed and then presented as morality, but it was simply relative to the culture. So there is no, so you look through the word justice and you see public opinion. You see a survey. Others would take the utilitarian route. When you look through the word good, what it really means is the greatest good for the greatest number. Okay. So modernity has what I'll call a drive to look through words that I think are foundational of the human experience and see through them that they're about something else. So C.S. Lewis and many others. Oh, by the way, I was alluded to this because I'm an avid reader of Jonah Goldberg's weekly columns, and he spoke about this, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and I went back and looked at C.S. Lewis. I'm greatly indebted to Jonah Goldberg, A, for teaching me new things and reminding me things that I thought I knew, but forgot about. So Jonah Goldberg says, this is not original to me. It's C.S. Lewis. I want to remind you. I said, thank you, Jonah. I think I read that and I forgot about it. And again, it's not just Jonah Goldberg and it's not just C.S. Lewis. It's something that you'll see. For example, I think in G.E. Moore, a great moral philosopher at the turn of the last century and someone who studied language. And he talked about, again, if I'm not mistaken, that words like right, moral, ethical, true, etc., all involve each other, which tells you that you've hit a word that in a core way organizes human experience, which means there's no other word that you can find. So that is right, which is that which is truly moral. Moral is that which is right. Moral truth is that which leads to what is right. So if you look at words like right, true, moral, etc., they all involve each other. So it's not some kind of nefarious game. He says when you reach words that all involve each other, and I believe this is what G.E. Moore said. If it's not G.E. Moore, it's a contemporary of his. That you actually hit at a root of human experience, and you can't analyze it further. So you've hit at something essential to the human condition. So we're going to ask ourselves. When you think of any culture that has any kind of moral teaching, do they have words such as right, true, and moral in their own language? Or is it implied in their systems of morality, duties, etc.? And I would say yes. I mean, for example, there's no actual natural Hebrew word for moral. Hebrew says musari from musar, which is character ethics. So even though Hebrew does not have a natural Hebrew idea for the word moral, they borrow it from character ethics, which is musar. So in Hebrew, the term would be hendiatus, two words together, hayashar v'hatov. Hayashar means which is right, straight, and true. So when you see in the Bible, vasita hayashar v'hatov, and you shall do what is straight and good, that's the way, for example, that Hebrew expresses the morally correct thing to do. So I'm not saying that every tradition, every language system has one word that matches moral, ethical, right, and true. What I'm saying, the idea is there, and it might actually take a few words there. All right, so what is postmodernism? And this is, again, it disturbed me from the first time I heard it. Postmodernism says, these words don't name anything real. They name a societal consensus, and every person experiences it differently, and since we experience it differently, it doesn't have reality. Now, I've heard this everywhere that I've gone as a teacher when I proposed to talk about moral realism. Most disturbingly, when I taught Holocaust at USC. Now, my predecessor taught history of Holocaust, and I was doing my doctorate in religion and social ethics, so I wanted to start with moral realism. Why was the Holocaust wrong? Now, that might astonish you that I actually had to propose the question, why is the genocidal murder of innocents wrong? Because I think it was a question that had been skipped. And the students were saying, well, isn't what is right and moral the greatest good for the greatest number? So if in Germany, a greater number of Germans wanted to kill the Jews, and there weren't that many Jews, greatest good for the greatest number, so I guess murdering Jews was right. Now, I'm quoting people. I'm not making this up. Who's to know? There were, I think, 60 million Germans and 300,000 Jews, and greatest good for the greatest number, get rid of the Jews. I guess it's right. Well, from a utilitarian calculus, you really can't argue with that. And I had a student stand up and explain it, Jewish, and he said, well, I'm a Jew, so I don't like it, but, like from a wider perspective, I can't defend against the Holocaust. And he said it with great aplomb. So who got outraged? Pardon me, taking a break from the tape. Could we have gallery view? Because I'd like to be able to get a read on the response to what I'm teaching. Okay, back to the recording. I think I've shared with you before, the students who stood up in outrage were the students from Catholic schools, not Jewish schools, not Jewish day schools, not Jewish high schools, because somehow this idea of moral subjectivism, moral relativism, and utilitarianism seem to be in the very water and air of young people throughout college, and to the point that when I would teach about moral realism, for example, at the Wexner Heritage Program in the Brandeis Bardeen Institute, everybody thought the same thing, although no one can remember where they learned it. So I'm going to say it's a default part of our culture, this idea of moral relativism, moral subjectivism, and utilitarianism, none of which actually means moral. None of which actually means moral. So what does moral mean? At a minimum, it means a standard for right conduct beyond human opinion, whether individual, societal, or societal. So the fact that a group of people say, well, we should do this, we ought to do this, I can still say, but is it moral? An individual could say, well, the way I understand my moral duties, it doesn't include, for example, the duty to be honest when it counts. And I could say, yeah, but is that moral? They say, well, moral is what I decide. The word moral does not contain the idea, it's what I decide. The word moral does not contain the idea, but everybody thinks it. The word moral contains the idea that there's a metaphysical standard that human beings can get wrong, individuals, groups, nations, etc. Now, and then I figure out why this is so alarming to people. When I would teach it, people would say, as a term of rebuke, you sound like an absolutist, which is a bad thing. Because people had this idea that there's two options for human thinking, opposed to each other, tolerance and absolutism. Again, it's a completely false dichotomy, but I realized that was the wound that I was touching. People were taught tolerance. It's a very strong Jewish idea. I probably heard about tolerance, all throughout Hebrew school confirmation. Now, why tolerance? Because I think Jews as an ethnic minority felt the intolerance of others. And we noticed that blacks felt intolerance and other ethnic racial groups felt intolerance. So we preached tolerance, which was accepting of difference. So this is against an absolutist idea of what's a true American, a white, Christian, Anglo-Saxon, et cetera. Said, no, we need to be tolerant of different Americans because we are all Americans. It went something like that, and I think it's actually quite true. It's Martin Luther King. We don't judge a person by the color of their skin, but rather by the content of their character. That's an absolute core element of liberal philosophy. Now, therefore, being absolutist was a bad thing. I mean, you could not be talked out of a wrong opinion. So I was always careful to say, I'm a moral realist, meaning I believe there are really better and worse answers to moral questions. I don't always know what a moral question is. I certainly don't know the answers, but a moral question is a real question. I'm not asking, what's your opinion? I'm not asking, what does a given society do? If I want to talk about, for example, the moral crime of massacring innocents, I'm not saying, so what do you think? Maybe that will tell me what's moral. Or what does Hamas think? Maybe that will tell me what's moral. Or what do these, perfidious agitators that on campuses, that we agree with Hamas and massacre of Israelis as part of resistance. I'm not going to ask them what's moral because I don't care about their opinion. I mean, I like to know their opinion, but it has nothing to do with what's moral. So I'm a moral realist, meaning there are better and worse answers to moral questions, and people's opinions actually don't matter. What matters is reasoning toward a moral answer. Now, if someone says, for example, murder of Israelis is not only morally permissible, it's morally right, that interests me. I mean, I'm offended by it, but I'm interested by it. Because I have to understand now, this is where I want to talk to us as a community of seekers of meaning, which means not only do we want to have moral opinions about what is really morally better or worse, but we want to understand people. In what world, in what ideational world, is the massacre of innocents both permissible and maybe even a duty? What world is that? Well, it's the world of critical theory. It's the world of critical theory. That's that world. Now, that world, I'll call it critical theory gone bad because I think there's some critical theory that's actually quite good and quite important. This kind of critical theory goes back to Marx. It's Marxism, where the Marxist idea, the core idea is our society, our economy especially, is constructed of a ruling elite, the oppressors, and the victims. So everywhere is arranged as oppressors and victims. So morality, from Marxist perspective, is typically used by the ruling elite to control the victims, the masses. You may have heard this before. What is morality? It's simply a tool. Religion in general, the opiate of the masses, Marx would say, in order to control the proletariat. So when Marx wants the proletariat to rise up in revolt, he wants them to understand that the deeper structure of morality is a device of oppression. And therefore, release yourself from the chains of bourgeois morality. Remember, Marx hated the bourgeoisie. Release yourself and realize that your purpose in life is to overthrow the ruling elite. And when you look at the development of Marxian to neo-Marxian thought, for example, revolutionary theory of Lenin and others, and then all liberation movements, murder was not wrong. Because what is right and wrong? What's wrong is the ruling elite. Anything the proletariat does to overthrow the ruling elite is by definition right. So that's right and wrong. Wrong is being part of the ruling elite, including colonization, imperialism, and capitalism. I have to remind you, from a Marxian perspective, capitalism does not mean greed. Capitalism is not about money. Most people just don't understand. And no one's fault because no one, like I did. I had to study Marx for my sins. I had to study 1,000 pages of Marx a week when I was in graduate school. Capitalism is a relationship of the ruling elite to the proletariat, where the ruling elite strips workers of the value of what they produce. For example, if I'm a chair manufacturer and I have a chair factory and my workers make chairs and I sell chairs and I keep the profit, I'm stealing the labor of my workers. I'm stealing their labor. So the relationship of the owner to the worker is a relationship of theft. Now, when we think of theft, that would mean raiding their bank accounts. From Marx's perspective, merely hiring somebody is an act of theft, which is odd. I oftentimes bring up my jujitsu buddy, his name is Vince, he owns a bakery. Vince is a capitalist because he's stealing the labor of his employees. But if you work for Google and make $2 million a year, you're an oppressed proletariat because you work for somebody. So from a Marxian perspective, labor is theft. Owners are thieves. Workers, the products of labor, are stolen by anybody who employs them. Now, with that structure, so what is the proletariat? They want to take back what is rightly theirs. So from Marx's perspective, the workers in my friend's bakery should overthrow my buddy, maybe kill him and his family, and take over the bakery. Well, good luck with that, because I think if they could run a bakery, they'd have actually already created their own bakery. One reason they're working for my buddy is they don't know how to run a bakery. It's actually quite difficult work. So the myth of all this is that someone who owns something is there in order to set up a thievery business, thievery of labor, of value, as opposed to they're good at managing. They're good at taking risk. They're entrepreneurs, and other people are not so good at that. And therefore, you can either employ or be an employee, but it is not an arrangement of theft. Now, see that, so when you have to understand, how could they go into Israel and massacre and kill men, women, and children? Why? Because by definition, as colonists, which of course they are not, and agents of imperialism, which of course they are not, they are oppressors. They're Marxian oppressors. There's no justice system outside of oppressed and victim. That's the only system there is from this very debased Marxian perspective. So therefore, resistance against oppressors is naturally right. Now, when you hear this, where a person says, no, murdering Israelis is not wrong, it's resistance. Resistance against oppressors, against colonists and imperialists. Therefore, it's actually right. That's why we celebrate it. Now, we're astonished, we're dismayed when we hear this. But I want to share with you in what world this makes sense. So when you study the history of liberation movements, liberation means liberating victims from oppressors, including colonists, imperialists, etc. And of course, because of postmodernist uses of language, colonist, oppressor, imperialist, genocide can mean anything they want it to mean because words don't have meanings. Words mean whatever they want it to mean. So now look at this terrible, toxic stew we have. The world is constructed into oppressors and victims. Oppressors, for example, owners of anything, you are naturally an oppressor, you're wrong, and therefore whatever you have should be pillaged, and maybe you should be killed because you're an oppressor. Anybody who's on the other side of this is the oppressed. And they have a natural right, from a Marxian perspective, a natural right to resist, which involves a natural impunity from murder. Now, one thing you'll notice when you look at history of liberation movements, and I want you all to take a few moments out sometime this weekend and study what happened in Algeria, the French colony of Algeria, and when liberation politics hit Algeria. And I want you to study it because it's not America, and it's not Israel, and it's not Jews. It's something else so you can look at objectively. The amount of murder, atrocities by both sides just staggers the imagination. How many tens of thousands of people were murdered. And so who was the enemy of the so-called liberation movement in Algeria? The moderates. French moderates were murdered, atrocities committed, and Algerian moderates. Why? Because moderates were interfering with the revolution. What the liberation movement wanted was things get so bad and lure the French into overreaction that would prove that they were oppressors and then increase the ranks of the so-called liberation movement, which themselves engaged in horrible, horrible atrocities because there was no right and wrong other than fighting imperial French colonialism. That was the only right and wrong. So when you look at the atrocity, people say, but isn't that murder? Of course it's not murder. They're French. But isn't murdering fellow Algerian Muslims wrong? Of course not. They're moderates. They're enabling the French. So they would be utterly quizzical about this. So between what I'll call the setup, the vacuum of morality that relativism sets up, relativism, subjectivism, etc., it sets up a vacuum of morality I'll call that postmodernism. It sets up the idea that words mean anything we want them to mean. And then neo-Marxism and critical theory fills it in. So when you see this person on TV or being interviewed and they say, of course murdering settlers is not wrong. Of course invading, Hamas invading Israel and murdering people is not wrong. It's called resistance, and resistance is automatically justified. Now, I want to take the time out today for you to understand what we're facing. So when they say it's genocide, and you say to yourself, but don't words have meanings? I mean, isn't this the tragedy of civilians being killed in a war where the enemy won't provide shelter for civilians, which they could have. Their whole tunnel system could have been a bomb shelter system, but they were terror tunnels. Isn't it true that Israelis, by and large, are trying to minimize civilian casualties? Well, if you're on the other side, if you're on the postmodernist neo-Marxian side, you might say one death of civilians is genocide, because that's how they use the word genocide. That's just the way they use the word. You can't talk them out of it, because genocide can mean anything they want it to mean. Now, we know, I think with assurance, that Hamas produced casualty figures are lies. They're absurd. When you look at how statisticians have examined the steadily rising 175 people a day rising casualties. It's like an even statistical line, which is absurd, impossible. There's no independent reporting, no independent verification. But if you were to say these numbers are fabricated, what will they do? They won't reason with you, because reasoning is a bourgeois way of talking. Remember, with the postmodern neo-Marxian camp, the only way of talking is intimidation. So if you say, but those casualty numbers are made up, they won't talk. They will intimidate. They'll yell. They'll scream. They'll shut you down. That's part of their tactics, and it's not tactics that came up from passion. They are learned tactics. If you go to the Wall Street Journal today, they've exposed that people have been training for these campus takeovers, including all of their tactics, for years. Years and years and years they've been training for this day, which is why they're so set up and ready to go, including intimidation, shouting down other people, luring the police into a response to create a police riot. This is all planned. And I'll say very, very cleverly planned. And of course, we on the other side, we're flat-footed because we don't plan for these things. So when you see this, when you see these utterly outrageous statement, genocide is whatever we want it to mean. The murder of Israelis is justified. The murder of Israelis is morally required. Israel is a colony. Israel is imperialistic. There's no talking to be done because it's what I call a quasi-religion. You can't talk somebody out of their religion. You can't tell an Orthodox Jew that Moses didn't receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. You can't talk a dedicated Muslim that Muhammad was not the prophet of God. You can't talk a Christian, a fundamentalist Christian, that Jesus was, is the Son of God sent down here to die for our sins. I mean, those are core. And if they give that up, then there's a question: what kind of Jew, Christian, Muslim are there? So we are talking to people who are actually promoting a religion. It's a religion. So I'll just end by saying why we are in such trouble and what we can do. One reason we're in trouble is when Thomas Jefferson wrote, by the way, it's not in the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson wrote a wall of separation between church and state. In his mind, it was Christianity, versions of Christianity. So it's a so-called regular religion, like when you study comparative religion, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism. Jefferson never countenanced quasi-religions, including liberation movements, which I think qualify as religions. We don't have a language for it. So when they go into the classroom and they're teaching this religion called liberation, which is a religion, it's not against any norm because it's not an identified religion. I would forbid it because I see it as a religion. Now, what is one of the outposts of this religion? DEI. DEI is an evangelical movement for liberation religion because they're not teaching diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're teaching that the world is constituted by oppressors and victims, and all oppressors are bad, and therefore the job is to expose the white supremacy, the capitalists, etc. Well, that's an evangelical movement of liberation theology. So when we realize that, now take it back to us, our children are being sent into institutions that are preaching a very, very bad, pernicious religion. And they're not immune from it because we have not prepared them. So what do? We have to teach the foundations of the liberal state as it were, religion, meaning we are all equal before God and before the law, whether you are white, black, Jew, Muslim, any other ethnic group, and you are not morally deficient if you have money, and you're not morally privileged if you don't have money. It has nothing to do with your moral standing. Everybody is equal before the eyes of God and before the eyes of the law. When someone mentions white supremacy and capitalism, it's antithetical to liberal values because we're equal. So how are you judged? You're judged on what you do, not your status, but what you do. That's, content of character, as Martin Luther King would say. We have to teach that. So I'm thinking, every Hebrew school class would begin as, we are all equal before the eyes of God and the law before you, whether you're rich or poor or white or black, Jew or Muslim, doesn't matter. We are equal before the eyes of God and the Lord. Everybody got that? Okay, write that in your little notebook. Now we're going to go on. Language has meaning. Words have meanings. Of course, there's a subjective dimension, but words do not mean anything you want them to mean. Who said that? Humpty Dumpty. You don't have the Humpty Dumpty. He fell off the wall. And all the king's horses and horses of king's men could not put Humpty together again. Because the idea that language means nothing, you're going to crash into fragments. So actually, language communicates meaning. It's a difficult idea. But words don't get to mean whatever you want them to mean. So we're against postmodernism. Third, and I think the entire Western tradition, including Islam, relies on this, is the capacity to reason. Because we experience moral reality, because we have language, at least to communicate ideas in depth, we have a natural capacity to reason. So if someone says to me, reasoning is a patriarchal manipulation to oppress people, I'll say, no, reasoning is reasoning because you just try to reason and persuade me out of my idea. So if reasoning is so bad, why are you trying to reason with me and counter my idea? You're using the patriarchal system to oppress. You're trying to oppress me. So if you don't want to reason, let's don't reason. Let's just say words, parrot, iceberg, mud. You say 3 words, and that's all we'll do. Okay. So, and of course, fourth is, I'm going to say the depth of moral reality. All right. So that's, I wanted to use last night and today to give you a larger philosophic depth to what we're up against and what we stand for, and therefore, in every conversation about this, you need to say, wait, are we not all rights endowed human beings, equal before God and the law, at least ideally? Yes. So some human beings, regardless of where they live, their religion, their color, their financial status, they're not bad or good. They're bad or good depending on what they do. Would we agree? Yes. Would we agree that, relatively speaking, words have meanings? Yes. Okay, so now we can talk. If they can't agree to that, no use talking. You're talking to a fundamentalist of a religion that I think is antithetical to the well-being of humankind.